No, senior management have to exhibit the values that they expect others to follow. And if they don't do it, people are not going to pay attention if the people at the top are saying, do as I say, and then they're doing something different. What I think is missing is that people at the bottom don't see the consequences for people at the top. So it may be that there are consequences, but they're not told about it. The way to change behavior is to get it here. And the way to do that is through stories, because it makes it personal, because people can imagine themselves in that position and can think about what they would or would not have done. And it sticks. If you want to teach morality, you tell stories. Human nature doesn't change. Technology does. You are not going to eliminate sin, if I can put it like that. And if you look back at every financial scandal going back to the tulip mania in the 16th, 17th century, it happens every 10 years on average, and it's pretty much the same. And, it's the same things. The reasons why people misbehave are not usually from malice, actually. I mean, there are some people who go in deliberately to be malicious, but it's usually because there are 5 reasons. Greed, and it can be greed for money, but it can be greed for titles, status, whatever. Stupidity is probably one of the biggest causes. Complacency, that's a big risk. People think, well, we've been through all of this, we've done all the effort, we've done the work, we've got, our culture program in place, we've got the rules, we're off the FCA's naughty list, etc. And then people get complacent. And hubris. If you hear somebody say, this time it's different, take your money out the bank, put it under the mattress, because it's never, that's hubristic. And cowardice. People get into a muddle. They make a mistake. They don't know how to get out of it. One of the key things is that you want to give people an off-ramp to get out of the hole they've got themselves into, instead of themselves digging deeper into it. The role of surveillance is not to discover somebody doing something bad and then they get hauled off to disciplinary. It can be discovering somebody writing something foolish and raising it with their manager.
So I think it'd be very foolish for the UK to race to the bottom. However, I do think that the international competitiveness angle and the growth angle are extremely high up the political agenda. And I think I alluded to it at the beginning. Some form of streamlining wholesale only regulation as opposed to retail regulation, and some greater coordination with other regulators in the space, like the pension regulators. I think that's a sensible thing to do.
I think some greater personal liability, personal accountability might be a way to go. And I know we're sort of seeing the regulators view that as being a more active tool. And I think that does make folks sit and stop and think more carefully when it's their own, not reputation or money, but it's their own liberty, which is at stake when they're offending. And potentially, I think that's a way that the regulator could really bring it to the individual to manage that.
So I was the chair of the committee that wrote all the rules for EMEA, MiFIR, and MiFID II from a data perspective, i.e. what you have to report, when, who to. MiFID II's got 1.4 million paragraphs of legislation, not 1.4 million lines, 1.4 million paragraphs. It is quite a big ask to get the permafrost to get their head around that.
Yeah, all I will say is you've got the 10 commandments, and 3 of them are don't lie, don't steal, and don't covet other people's goods. And frankly, they say pretty much the same thing. You have to understand the risk you run in a bank, and the risk you run in a bank is human. Right? Everybody focuses on the credit, the market, all the rest of it. But Sergio's right. The biggest risk you run is the human risk. And the mistake that happens is, because it's such a geeky industry, numbers and algorithms and systems and all the rest of it, people are not really very good at understanding human motivation, why people make mistakes, and how you help people who have made mistakes get out from the mistake that they've got themselves into in a way that doesn't cause a bigger problem.
What I do see, I think, from the executives in compliance that I speak to is that there's so much validation from other quarters. They're often very much answerable to a global head, a head of compliance, a head of the business, a head of model validation, a head of audit, and the significant governance burden that's required to satisfy and then report different stuff to each of those, that it does offer them some protection from personal liability. However, I probably think that many of them would prefer not to have that burden to suffer in order to make a more effective program at genuinely trying to identify things that are worth identifying and report them, rather than being death by red tape. The liability around the role is certainly acute, and pressure is placed on individuals who have that liability, which I think, is deterrent for good people to get involved. And it's a constrained resource environment for decent compliance officers, and who'd want to be a compliance officer, right?
Putting all that risk and all that liability on one person who isn't ultimately the decision maker is not fair, frankly. And I think, to your point about the public, what the public want to see is the people at the top take the responsibility. And in a way, there's individual malfeasance where people should take responsibility. That's one thing. But then leadership is something different, which is the people at the top take responsibility because they are the leaders, not necessarily because they did anything wrong, but because something, so terrible has happened that somebody has to carry the can. And in my view, if you're at the top of an organization, that is your job. That is why you're at the top of the organization. That's why you're paid the big bucks, to put your body in front of the train first. And I think shifting it down to people at a level where they have a huge amount of responsibility, but they are not the ultimate decision makers, feels like a bit of a cop-out.